Hello, I'm Jenya DeLima. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the author-focused podcast that takes a whole person approach to everything related to both writing and editing. When you hear the phrase ghost story, you might think of a crumbling Victorian, worn-down headstones, or translucent specters dressed in long, flowing white gowns. But how do these tropes differ from the contemporary ghost story? And what new ways have we found to explore the presence of something that is supernaturally other? Author Daniel Braum is here to give us his answers to these questions. Oh, lovely to have you back.
Thank you for having me back and for talking about ghost stories. How nice.
It's so nice. Well, so going to this newest collection, your first line in Phantom Constellations feels very appropriate for this topic. You wrote, "Are you seeing what you think you are seeing?" And I'd like to have you explain why this line is really at the core of so many ghost stories.
I could narrow the scope of that question. I could speak for my ghost stories. I can't speak for the trope in general, but for me, it is a perhaps a different kind of ghost stories, as you said so well in your introduction. I think that that line shifts it away from its origins in the Victorian and the sheet-clad specter. It brings it more towards a different kind of ghost, either perhaps a literary ghost or a humanistic ghost, or the ghosts that even outside of our fiction that we experience and live within our own lives.
Mm.
And perhaps that these are stories that are more about those very human phenomenon of the unreliable nature of our perceptions, our lives, and our relationships, which I
Yeah,
hope makes for interesting fiction and interesting stories.
you talk about that a lot, not just in the introduction, but in some of the stories. Similar lines come up about doubting your perception or that constant change is the only thing we can rely on. And I feel like those also kind of get right back to that core message about nothing stays the same. And even the way that we write and the way that we perceive things isn't going to stay the same. So this ghost story isn't going to stay the same either.
Yeah, that is. I remember one of the characters is. I think that's in their internal dialogue, or they are fretting about it with someone. And yeah, these ghost stories. I like that you said that they don't stay the same. I think a lot of the stories in the book present as perhaps a different kind of trope, either something more classic or something that might seem on the nose that you've seen before. And I hope if I've done my job right, these stories, as they progress and the characters progress, they really end up in hopefully some very different, surprising, and interesting places than where we
Yes.
started.
I will say they do end in unexpected ways, especially the first one where I had to go back and almost take a moment and then just think about it because it wasn't really where I wanted it to go, even though I knew that that was the direction it very likely was not going to be heading in anyway. But you still have that little teeny bit of hope that you retain anyway. But
Are
it is,
you talking about Scarecrow and the
I
Imposter?
am.
Oh, I'd happily tell you my original plan for that, if that's not off the topic or how that happened. But
Yes, well, I'm going to hold you to that because now I desperately want to know.
oh, so I mean, the story is about someone who, a bit not acquainted with spoiler, but yeah, they do end up in meeting an alternate version of themselves, or coming into what's really happening is something secondary world like, and a secondary dimension. And this was a story that I had with me for a long time, and it wasn't written. Sometimes that's part of my process. And I thought for years, for a long time, I thought that the story was going to be completely different than what ended up on the page. I thought that the story was going to be, because he's dealing with grief and it's dealing with loss. He
Yeah.
has a chance. He has a chance to undo all that, and basically, he has a choice to take out his alternate world self and just sort of step into this other person's life and be with his lost love and all these things. And I thought, oh, it's great. He's just going to be this noble person, and he's going to have the chance to do wrong, and he's going to want to do it. But in the end, he's going to make the sacrifice, and he's just going to give up and go home. And I was like, man, I've seen that on Buffy and Angel. I've seen that in so many places. It was such a tired trope for me. And I set off to making turns in different directions, and that was not the story that is on the page.
Yeah, and I really want to talk about that story too, because we see that similar idea a lot in sci-fi. This type of story where we have this alternate self or this alternate reality that we've entered, and how often we see that presented in sci-fi novels where that's the main premise. So how are you then able to make it so it's now elevated horror or a ghost story rather than fitting more in with sci-fi?
Wow, and I'm not sure that I do. I think these categories are things that other people will put on it. I mean, you could very well. I'll try to answer the question directly as well, but yeah, it's worth pointing out that sometimes it is these arbitrary decisions. You can take a story, and if the publisher is X and if the marketing is X, then it becomes X, and the same, maybe almost the same exact story could be shelved and done as Y. That isn't necessarily on my mind when I'm writing it. I just try to stick to the emotional truths of what's at stake for the character, and perhaps that focusing more on the character dynamic and their internal stakes, and perhaps less of the mechanics. Maybe those are tropes that, okay, the emotional punch or the sort of ghostly punch is something that we readers tend to think of more as horror, and focusing maybe more on the mechanics of it or the technology of it, even though those are gross oversimplifications, then we might feel it's more sci-fi. But who knows? Who really knows?
Publishers apparently. That would I
They
think
sure do.
the ghostly punch and the emotional punch can often be the same thing, because having a ghost come up brings out a lot of emotions, even if it's not your stereotypical ghost. And I think that we usually associate fear with ghosts, but especially with your first story, we also associate loss and grief with it.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. I like the tying the supernatural to the emotional. I'm certainly not the first writer to do that, but it does take the shift away from fear. And perhaps in that way, these are getting back to more classical ghost stories. Yes, with people like M.R. James, ghosts are about malevolence and fear and that, but also we can go back to Dickens, and ghosts could be about warnings or benevolence as well. Like ghosts
Yeah,
do have many different roles in
and
in our
loss and
fiction.
regret, right? So then it's also too, when is the ghost just a ghost? And then when is the ghost part of a larger theme? Or when is the ghost symbolic?
Yeah, they're different strategies, and yeah, there's so many different choices and types of ghost stories. It's part of the joy of it, at least for me as a reader.
And what do you think some of the different types of ghost stories are? Or even how would you define the contemporary ghost story compared to, say, like a timeless classic ghost story?
I'm always hesitant to do so, but yeah, looking at what I was mentioning before, and perhaps some of the classic ones I'll say were those in Victorian times, or in the times of like where the ghost story was more mainstream, like Dickens, like it would come out in the paper, or M.R. James, like, yeah, let's gather around the fire, and like, okay, the ghost is here to teach us a lesson, or the ghost is here to scare our pants off, young students. I am your headmaster. Yeah, in the middle of the last century, that kind of shifted to writers were doing a lot of different things. One of them, Fritz Leiber, was using the ghost as symbol, even if the ghost was also, as you said, yeah, it is a ghost. And talking of the classic tale, the smoke ghost, but it was also very on the nose, meant to be talking about industrialization, and that's just one way. In the contemporary ghost story, perhaps the most recent ghost story I just read is in this book called Conjunctions 83. I'm holding it up, even though I know this is an audio podcast. It's a literary journal, and it was guest edited by Joyce Carol Oates. And the story
Oh,
that
yes,
the
you've told
story,
us.
yeah, the story that I read was called. The book concludes with a story called "Plunged in the Years" by an author I'm fond of, Jeffrey Ford. And hey, the right on the nose on that, like you can't even be sure that there is a ghost in there, and you're wondering, you're like, Jeff Ford, what are you doing? what seems like this straight up literary story until it gets kind of meta and the characters at one point say like, yeah, you don't even need to have a ghost to have a ghost story. You just need to have a haunting or haunting.
Oh,
And it's not a haunting necessarily in like, oh, boo, and there's a haunted house. It's like, yeah, they can be these stories. There's so many different ways that we can carry regret, loss, and emotion around. And this world is full of haunted people, and our stories are full of haunted people as well.
which reminds me of a question I had for you too about when we talk about ghosts being in interstitial places, do they have to be an actual place? Or kind of going back to the story you just talked about, can it be an emotional state like grief? Can we be haunting ourselves?
I absolutely feel that way. In fact, I'm most interested in those characters that are where it is a haunted place, even if it is in a story of a actual haunting as well.
That does come out a lot in your writing, even in just this collection, where even though they have these odd events happening around them, it's not that they're so much in their head, but they're just very aware of their own lives and their own mental space and what's going on and what's led to it and what they could do about it versus what they should do about it.
It makes for good conflict. Having what's internally or even externally at stake for the characters just makes it makes for good drama and good dramatic structure. And I always think choices in fiction makes for an interesting read.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, your stories could even lose a lot of the supernatural quality and then be rewritten so it's just, say, contemporary drama, and they would really still work. And I think it's just because you have put so much into exploring the characters and who they are, but also their history of how they came to be that way.
Well, thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I think it just shows how much you understand people and how perceptive you are, not just with yourself, but even the people you see around you in different ways, because you see that too with the characters here, where it's not just their awareness of themselves, but the awareness of the social hierarchy and then how they fit within it and how they're interacting with everyone else because of that.
Yeah, and sometimes those revelations in Phantom Constellation, some of the characters are not aware of themselves and have rude awakenings, and that makes for an enjoyable read too, I hope.
Yes. And I just love, though, how really you can have all these different types of people and in these different situations and in these different places in life. And yet they can all be haunted in some way or another, which maybe this really is like that great class barrier is we can all have our own ghost.
Ghosts are for everyone. Money won't protect you.
Yep. So I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but you also had a line that says, does the how matter? And it wasn't really written about this part, but how do you think dissecting and detailing the how behind these events affects these kinds of stories?
I think the way that people in life sometimes deal with the supernatural or the unexplained, or even just things that we don't understand, I think a very common way to that is like, well, I got to be at work at 3, or, this laundry ain't going to do itself, and yeah, there's no time for it, or even if there is time, it's like maybe it doesn't matter. It just is. I got a lesson from it or I didn't. There's meaning or there isn't. There's fate or there isn't. And maybe the way I'm just sort of giving the devil's advocate on that. Like, yeah, sometimes the supernatural is a catalyst for change and meaning and understanding. And sometimes it just isn't. Sometimes the ghost is just a ghost.
Yeah, they just totally dropped the ball. No moral lesson there. Tiny Tim isn't going to change his future.
Yeah, yeah. And just much as I like Dickens and I like those kind of stories, I also like stories both to read and write them of ones where it's like, yeah, sorry, folks, there is no comeuppance, there is no lesson learned here. It's like, yeah, life goes on.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because with most of your stories, as I'm thinking through them, that really just sort of seem to be the way that they take it. Just, okay, this is happening. And even though there might be some of that disbelief surrounding it at first, it's not enough disbelief to completely push it aside or trying to come up with some rational explanation. And eventually they just sort of go along with it. But I think it's exactly like you said, that's probably how most of us would react in real life. And even if you think about the people who say they've had ghostly encounters and that sort of thing, how many of them really have this 180 turnaround in who they are and how they live their life as a result? So it probably is more realistic to say it's not really going to change you, or it's not going to change you so greatly that it's worth noting.
And Dickens is shaking his fist at us behind the grave again. The signal man is beseeching us to get out of the way and do.
Yep. Well, we talked about this a little bit, but some of the different moods and emotional tones. What have you seen in ghost stories, and then what do you use in your own work?
The first position, I take that back. Yeah, very common one, or maybe one of the more original ones, is fear or horror. Perhaps that's why the ghost is most often, associated with the horror genre and not the sci-fi genre. But I said, well, okay, I see a lot of ghosts as horror. I see a lot of ghosts as fear. I like the ghost stories where it's the ghost as fascination or
Mm.
the ghost as wonder. Because, yeah, granted, like I'm the first to say I'll be scared as hell of a ghost, but maybe when I'm done being scared, I'm so curious and I'm so fascinated. So that will be my answer. The ghost as an element of wonder in fiction.
Oh, interesting. That kind of goes back to dissecting the how too, because you'd think if someone's curious, they'd want to know how do ghosts appear? How do we figure out who's going to be a ghost and who won't be a ghost? How long do ghosts stick around? And then all those other follow-up questions that sort of naturally flow from that.
It's a topic of much fascination on reality TV and ghost. I think perhaps the hobby or vocation of parapsychology and ghost hunting might be as big as it's ever been.
Well, going back a little bit to themes and then emotional mood, how do you think that these stories then respond to the actual world that we live in? So again, looking at this from a contemporary slant versus that more classic ghost story.
Perhaps they reflect the times that we are in, and it could be authors are writing them from different points of their life, and perhaps, and I could be totally wrong on this, but yeah, for this author, perhaps I couldn't have written these stories as a younger man. I'm thinking of Robert Smith, who is the lead singer of The Cure, and they recently released an album, and one thinks of The Cure as being, nostalgic, elegiac, or mournful or haunting. And when Smith was talking about this album, he was like, he goes, I thought, I thought I was haunted. I thought I was dark. I thought my younger self, knew what that meant. And he's like, I didn't know shit. I didn't know anything. And now the emotions that he experiences and writes about on these albums, he's like, now I feel like I know what loss is. I didn't know what loss was, even though I sung all about it. So maybe there's something to be said about, yeah, maybe these are times when there's a lot of loss. And in the micro of each personal author, yeah, there's a time in the life, but maybe there's something more to that.
Do you think,
I can't see the forest for the trees. I'm definitely in the trees on that one.
well, do you think these stories also help us process the world in any way or our own experiences?
I think they do. Even not necessarily my stories. I think talking to or listening to a lot of horror authors do write for that very reason. And so that probably means a lot of readers do as well.
hmm Well, and then to bring this back to your excellent collection, how does the title relate to ghost stories?
Yeah, it goes back to that line, the first line of the introduction of the human eye is perhaps the most unreliable narrator, the most unreliable instrument of perception that we know. And I use the analogy of a constellation just to illustrate that. Like the constellations are inventions. They're things that we made up, right? Like as much as we would like, there is no giant glowing scorpion in the
Aw.
sky. Those stars are billions of years away, and these are just shapes that we are assigning of them to make meaning of our world. And I think we do that in our own lives and with our own losses to stay together. The human mind makes connections when there are none. And going back to the how does it do that? maybe it's just part of being human. And maybe going back to the why, like maybe story is a function of what keeps us going, either in good
Ah,
times, in good times or bad. So these phantom constellations, well, what's the story of your life? What's the story of my life? How am I the main character of the story? Am I just a bit part in someone else's story? Or is everything I'm perceiving like complete, as in my own life? I'm like, oh, I thought I thought this was going on, but it's really not at all. So yeah, I think they're all different permutations of misperceptions, which is an oversimplification. Will find their way into the stories in Phantom Constellations.
well, before we end, which reading recommendations would you like to leave listeners with?
Well, you can't go wrong. Since I have it on hand, Revenants, the Ghost issue, which is Conjunctions 83, co-edited by Joyce Carol Oates and Bradford Morrow, has a lot of those contemporary ghost stories in it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me back. It was great talking about ghosts with you. Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you for listening. And be sure to check out the show notes for additional information, including all of Dan's links and a link to where you can purchase a copy of Phantom Constellations. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I'd greatly appreciate it if you shared it with a friend. Thanks again.